In the heart of Saxony, a small, isolated estate stood shrouded in mystery. Its gates, rusted by time, were seldom opened, and the crumbling manor seemed frozen in an era long past. But within the decaying walls of this forgotten estate, a story darker than the shadows that clung to its every corner awaited. This was not a tale of ordinary aristocrats or noble bloodlines. It was the story of a family cursed by their own choices, a lineage marked by secrets too horrific to be acknowledged. The estate, as much a prisoner of time as its inhabitants, bore the marks of a lineage that preferred to stay hidden. Here, in this forsaken place, births were never recorded. No names, no dates, no heirs to carry on the family's legacy. Yet, the whispers of what transpired behind those closed doors were loud enough to echo through the centuries, reaching even the ears of modern historians and curious minds who sought to uncover the dark truth. The mystery surrounding this estate begins with its bloodline. A family whose name has been lost to history, whose history itself was deliberately erased. There are no written records of the births that took place here, no official documents to trace the fates of the children born into this cursed family. The very act of birth itself was shrouded in secrecy, as if the family knew that even the act of coming into the world was too dangerous to record. But what was it that made this estate so different from all the others in Saxony? Why would a family, seemingly wealthy and in control, go to such extremes to keep their births hidden? The answer lies in the legacy they had inherited, a legacy of inbreeding that had slowly and silently ravaged their bloodline, leaving behind physical and mental deformities, and with them, a sense of impending doom. 4 generations, the family had intermarried, often within their own estate, to preserve their noble status, to keep the bloodline pure. But in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. What started as a precaution, perhaps a misguided attempt to maintain power, had spiraled into something far more sinister. As the years passed, the consequences of their isolation and inbreeding became more evident. Birth defects, mental instability, and strange ailments began to emerge in the family's offspring. Their once proud lineage was now plagued by a horrific, silent sickness that seemed to consume them from the inside out. The family, desperate to hide their shame, turned inward. Their estate became a prison, not just for their physical bodies, but for the very records of their existence. There would be no official births, no records to trace the line of succession. Their names were erased, their history buried beneath the weight of their genetic sins. And as the family's condition worsened, so did the rumors surrounding them. Locals who lived near the estate spoke in hushed tones about the strange goings-on behind the walls. There were stories of odd, malformed children who were never seen in public. Whispers of midnight rituals performed to try and cleanse the family of its curse, or to appease some unseen force that seemed to haunt them. Those who dared approach the estate reported strange sounds, faint cries, whispers, and the occasional glimpse of a shadow moving behind a curtain. The family, it seemed, had become little more than a ghost story, a dark legend that people dared not speak of too loudly. But what was the true story behind this cursed bloodline? Was it truly a curse, as the locals believed, or was there a more scientific explanation for the family's tragic fate? Could it be that the family's isolation and inbreeding had led to the genetic disorders that haunted them, slowly deteriorating their health over generations? As medical knowledge of genetics was still in its infancy, perhaps they never understood the dangers of their choices. Or perhaps they did, and it was their shame that kept them silent, locked away in their crumbling estate, trying desperately to hold on to a legacy that was already slipping through their fingers. In the absence of birth records, in the void left by their silence, the family story became a puzzle. Every fragment of information, every old letter, every forgotten diary, added a new layer to the mystery. How many children had been born? How many had survived? What had become of them? The few surviving records from the region are vague and often contradictory. Some speak of a family with a reputation for secrecy, others suggest that their wealth had once been vast, but over time, it had dwindled, leaving them with nothing but their crumbling estate and the twisted remnants of their bloodline. The estate itself had long since fallen into disrepair, its grandeur faded into obscurity, but even now, decades later, it still stands as a testament to the family's downfall, a silent witness to the legacy of inbreeding, isolation, and shame. But the silence surrounding the estate is not the only thing that lingers. There is also a sense of dread. The curse, if it truly existed, seems to have infected not just the family but the land itself. The estate is said to be haunted, not just by the ghosts of the family's past, but by the very spectre of their genetic legacy. Could the land itself be cursed? Or is it merely the stain of the family's actions that continues to haunt the place? Whatever the answer, the estate has become a symbol of tragedy, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and pride, and the price that must be paid for trying to define nature itself. Even today, there are those who still seek to unravel the mystery of the inbred estate. Modern-day researchers, geneticists, and historians have tried to piece together the family story, though the lack of official records makes their task nearly impossible. DNA tests, old bones, and family trees are all that remain, scattered fragments of a dark and forgotten past. But despite their efforts, the full truth remains elusive, a puzzle that may never be solved. For in the end, the family's greatest secret may not be what happened to them, but rather why they chose to keep their births, and their very existence, a secret in the first place. In the silence of the estate, where the shadows grow long and the winds whisper through the broken windows, the story of this cursed bloodline lives on. It serves as a reminder that some histories are not meant to be forgotten, and some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always find a way to resurface. The estate may be abandoned, but its dark legacy endures, echoing through the ages, a chilling reminder of the dangers of a bloodline twisted beyond recognition. And so, we are left to wonder, was this a family doomed from the start, or were they merely the victims of their own choices? Were they cursed, or was it the consequences of inbreeding and isolation that led to their downfall? The answers may never be fully known, but the haunting mystery of the inbred estate remains, waiting for those brave enough to seek the truth. In the early 18th century, Saxony was a land of contrasts, where the grandeur of noble estates stood in stark opposition to the grim realities of rural life. The region, nestled in what is now modern-day Germany, was a focal point for both the flourishing of European culture and the harshness of political intrigue. It was an era marked by the decline of the Holy Roman Empire and the rise of more centralized powers, yet Saxony, with its mix of feudal traditions and new, more modern ideas, remained a place of political and social complexity. Saxony's aristocracy, for the most part, had flourished under a system that prioritized bloodlines and lineage. Nobles were defined by their heritage, and titles passed down through the generations were regarded as the ultimate measure of a family's worth. However, in such a world, where bloodlines were so highly revered, the idea of preserving the purity of one's ancestry could become an obsession. This preoccupation with maintaining a noble family's unbroken line was, in some cases, taken to extreme measures, leading to isolation from the world, dangerous practices, and, ultimately, the formation of families whose survival depended on secrecy. The estate at the center of this mysterious narrative was a product of such an obsession. In the early 1700s, Saxony was not the well-documented place it is today. Records were sparse, especially in the rural areas where nobility lived in relative isolation. Most of Saxony's political and social history was dominated by the larger, more influential cities, where merchants, soldiers, and intellectuals converged. But in the countryside, beyond the reaches of the bustling cities and courtrooms, life was much quieter. And here, on the edge of the known world, families like the one at the heart of this story lived in isolation, shielded not just from the larger world, but from their own history. The estate was perched in a secluded part of Saxony, far from the well-traveled roads and the growing centers of commerce. Its location was, in a sense, a perfect reflection of the family's lifestyle, remote, cut off from civilization, and removed from the influences of the outside world. This physical separation, however, was not merely a matter of geography. It was, in fact, a deliberate choice. For this family, isolation was a necessary shield against the dangers of the world beyond. The estate allowed them to remain untouched by the political instability that plagued much of Europe at the time, and more importantly, it allowed them to control their lineage with a level of secrecy that could not have been maintained anywhere else. The history of the estate was rooted in the age-old tradition of noble families marrying for power, for land, and for the preservation of their bloodline. In an era where alliances through marriage were often more important than love or personal choice, the family's isolation allowed them to pursue a path of intermarriage that would ultimately spell their doom. Within these secluded walls, the rules of nature were bent, not by design but by necessity, as successive generations sought to preserve the purity of their blood, free from the mixing of outside influences. The practice of intermarriage, a form of inbreeding, was not unique to this family. In many aristocratic households across Europe, it was seen as a way to protect the family name and keep titles and wealth within the bloodline. However, in this case, the family's obsession with maintaining pure lineage took on a darker, more disturbing form. For generations, the estate's inhabitants married close relatives, cousins, and distant relatives, all in the name of preserving their noble status. But what they failed to realize was that each generation of intermarriage came with its own set of biological risks that were exacerbated by their isolation. Saxony, like much of Europe, was a place where superstition often intertwined with daily life. People believed in curses, omens, and the influence of unseen forces. Medical knowledge was still in its infancy, and genetics was a mystery known only to the most learned of scholars. Even the concept of hereditary diseases was not fully understood, and the dangers of inbreeding were only beginning to be explored. But the family's decision to marry within their own ranks, generation after generation, was a reckless gamble with their own biology. As the years passed, the results became more evident. Children born from these unions began to suffer from strange ailments, physical deformities, mental illness, and debilitating genetic disorders that made their very existence a struggle. Yet despite the growing evidence of the dangers of inbreeding, the family persisted in their ways. The social pressure to maintain their noble title was too great, and so they continued to marry within their own circle, sealing their fate with each new generation. They became increasingly isolated from the world outside, their family a closed-off unit, hidden behind the high walls of their estate. The more the family withdrew from society, the more their peculiarities became apparent. Locals began to notice strange happenings, whispering about the family's odd behavior, their reclusive nature, and the mysterious children born in the estate. Rumors spread, fueled by the lack of official records and the family's growing sense of shame. In the midst of this isolation, the family's relationship with the outside world became increasingly strained. No longer part of the vibrant life of Saxony's courts or cities, they were cut off from the very social fabric that had once defined them. What had begun as an attempt to maintain power and privilege slowly descended into a quiet, tragic retreat from reality. There were no visitors to the estate, no alliances forged through marriage, no business conducted with the outside world. The estate became a prison of their own making, and with it, their bloodline began to deteriorate. The family's reclusion wasn't just a matter of geography, it was a matter of survival. They had created a world within their estate where only they could exist, where they could protect their genetic secrets and hide from the shame of their own biology. Their lack of contact with the outside world ensured that their lineage would remain, for better or worse, undisturbed. But it also meant that no one could intervene, no outside force could save them from their own decline. In the end, they were their own prison wardens, and their downfall was inevitable. As the family's health deteriorated, so did their estate. Once a symbol of noble wealth and power, it became a crumbling reminder of the consequences of obsession and isolation. What was once an idyllic country home became a place of death and decay, a testament to the devastating effects of a bloodline bent on maintaining its purity at all costs. The family's inability to break free from their self-imposed isolation mirrored their genetic decline, a slow, inexorable slide into extinction. And so, the estate stood, a silent witness to the fall of a once proud family, hidden away in the remote corners of Saxony. It was a place where the past had been erased, where the scars of inbreeding and isolation left an indelible mark on both the land and the people who once called it home. What had begun as a noble attempt to preserve blood and power had turned into something far more tragic, a dark history lost to time, hidden in the shadow of an estate that would forever remain a mystery. The estate, secluded deep within the heart of Saxony, was a place that seemed almost forgotten by time itself. Surrounded by dense forests, far from the main roads that connected villages and towns, it existed in a world of its own. The land was lush, but wild, untamed by the careful cultivation of the larger estates that dotted the countryside. The estate's imposing gates were once grand, but now they were rusted and covered in ivy, a sign of years, perhaps centuries, of neglect. A long, winding path led up to the manor, flanked by the decaying remnants of once proud hedges. The main house, a towering structure with peeling stonework and broken windows, looked more like a haunted ruin than a place of noble residence. When one approached the estate, the first thing they might notice was the silence. Unlike other noble homes that often buzzed with the sounds of servants, guests, and the occasional music drifting through the windows, this place was still, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The air hung heavy with an eerie calm, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The grandeur of the manor, though faded, was still present, and anyone who entered might have once been struck by its scale, its tall towers, arched windows, and the sprawling grounds that surrounded it. Yet, despite its grandeur, there was an undeniable sense of decay that pervaded the estate, as if it had been frozen in time, not out of beauty, but out of necessity. Inside the house, the walls seemed to groan with age, the very foundation of the building seeming to sag under the weight of history. Faded portraits of long-forgotten ancestors still hung crookedly on the walls, their painted faces staring out with vacant eyes. The furniture, once rich and opulent, was now covered in dust, and the floors, though still grand in their design, creaked beneath the weight of anyone who dared to walk upon them. The rooms were filled with the remnants of a forgotten past, old tapestries that had lost their colors to the passage of time, shattered glass from once stunning chandeliers, and bookshelves lined with volumes whose leather bindings had long since cracked and peeled away. Every corner seemed to hold a story, but one that no longer had an audience. Despite the estate's physical decay, there was still a palpable sense of purpose in its isolation. The family that had once lived here had built this home to serve as their fortress, a place where they could live in seclusion, away from the prying eyes of the world. It was as much a prison as it was a residence, a fortress not only against the elements and the outside world but against the genetic forces that were slowly consuming their bloodline. The walls of this home, as much as they were a barrier against the outside, had also become a barrier to the truth. Within these walls, the family had created a world where they could hide their shame, where their secrets could remain locked away from the world. The estate had always been a place of refuge, a place where the family could maintain their position and their bloodline without interference. For generations, the family had lived here in relative peace, protected by their wealth and their nobility. But as the years went by, the family became increasingly insular. The walls that had once protected them began to close in around them, creating a kind of bubble where they could hide from the rest of the world. In a time when power was often determined by alliances and marriages, the family had chosen to turn inward, to keep their bloodline pure by marrying among themselves. This decision, though born of noble intentions, would ultimately lead to their undoing. It wasn't just the isolation of the estate that made it so unique, it was the secrecy that surrounded it. The family's decision to live in seclusion was not simply a matter of preference, it was a matter of survival. Over time, as the family's health began to deteriorate from the effects of inbreeding, they became more reclusive. They stopped interacting with the outside world, cutting off any contact with distant relatives, other noble families, or even their tenants. The estate became their entire world, and the world outside became a distant memory. There were no visitors, no social gatherings, no interactions with the larger community. Everything about the family's existence was hidden behind the thick stone walls of the manor. In the early years, the family had been seen as a normal, if somewhat eccentric, part of Saxony's noble class. They were wealthy, powerful, and influential in their own right. But over time, as the effects of inbreeding began to manifest in their children, their reputation began to fade. Strange rumors started circulating among the locals. Some said that the family had become mad, that they were cursed, or that they were performing bizarre rituals in an attempt to ward off their declining health. The truth was far less supernatural, but it was no less tragic. The family's decision to isolate themselves had allowed their genetic condition to fester unchecked. Over time, the children born on the estate became increasingly affected by birth defects, mental illnesses, and physical disabilities. The family, rather than seeking help or leaving the estate for medical attention, chose to hide their condition from the outside world. As the family's health worsened, the estate itself began to deteriorate as well. What was once a shining example of aristocratic pride became a symbol of decline and decay. The once beautiful gardens were overgrown with weeds, and the fountains, which had once provided a soothing sound, had long since dried up. The family's wealth, though once vast, had slowly diminished over the years, and there was no longer any money to maintain the estate. The once gleaming walls of the manor were now covered in mildew, and the grand hallways were dimly lit by the flickering light of candles. The estate, once a reflection of the family's power and pride, had become a haunting reminder of their fall from grace. Yet, despite the visible decay, the estate remained, a silent sentinel to the family's decline. There was something strangely enduring about it, something that kept it standing even as everything around it crumbled. Perhaps it was the family's unwillingness to let go of their past, or perhaps it was the sheer isolation of the estate that kept it untouched by the world beyond. Either way, the estate stood as a testimony to a family that had, for better or worse, chosen to retreat from the world, to hide away from the very forces that could have saved them. The house, in its quiet, decaying state, became more than just a building. It became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the family. The windows, once grand and full of life, were now nothing more than broken shards of glass. The once pristine marble floors were cracked and worn down by years of neglect. The air inside the manor was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew hung heavy in the air. Yet, there was something about the estate's crumbling walls and silent halls that made it more haunting than any grand, well-kept castle. It was as if the house itself was a reflection of the family's dark history, a history that had been buried so deep, it had become part of the very fabric of the estate itself. It was in this decaying house, this lonely estate, that the family's secrets remain hidden, locked away from the world. The records, the histories, the births, they all remained unspoken, unwritten, and erased from history. The family's refusal to record their births, to acknowledge their existence, was not simply an act of secrecy, it was an act of denial, an attempt to erase their own history and the shame that had come with it. The estate, with all its decay and isolation, stood as a testament to the family's refusal to confront the consequences of their actions. It was a place where history had been buried, but not forgotten, a place where the dark legacy of inbreeding and isolation still haunted the walls. The family that inhabited the isolated estate in Saxony had long been a mystery, not only to their neighbours but to history itself. Their lineage, stretching back generations, was marked by an almost obsessive need to preserve the purity of their bloodline, to maintain their nobility and wealth at any cost. But this desire to keep their family bloodline pure led them down a path from which there was no return. The obsession with lineage and status took a dark turn as the family began to intermarry, forming a closed circle where cousins married cousins, and distant relatives were brought together in an attempt to solidify the family's noble position. At first glance, their marriage practices may have seemed harmless. After all, in the aristocratic circles of 18th century Europe, marrying within one's own social class, or even within one's own family, was not unusual. In many cases, it was considered an acceptable means of preserving power, wealth, and influence. Royal families across Europe, especially in monarchies, often married within the family to secure alliances, ensure the purity of royal blood, and maintain control over vast estates. But this family in Saxony took these practices to an extreme, and what began as a strategy for survival soon spiraled into a tragic genetic experiment gone awry. It wasn't that the family didn't recognize the risks of inbreeding. In fact, it is likely that they were aware of the potential dangers, but their obsession with lineage and their need to maintain control over their estate blinded them to the consequences. In the early generations, the results may have seemed relatively minor, perhaps some children born with slight deformities, perhaps a few mental health issues that were dismissed as minor afflictions. But as the generations passed and the practice of inbreeding became more entrenched, the effects became increasingly severe. The physical consequences of inbreeding are well documented in modern science. The closer the blood relations of two individuals, the higher the likelihood that recessive genetic disorders will be expressed in their offspring. These can range from physical deformities to mental illness, and in the case of this family, the effects were catastrophic. As each new generation was born, the children became progressively more afflicted. The family that had once prided itself on its noble heritage and untouchable bloodline began to see the very fabric of their lineage unravel. At first, it was subtle. A child might be born with a slight limp or perhaps a speech impediment, small markers that could be overlooked or explained away by the family. But over time, these minor imperfections grew into more severe disabilities. Children began to suffer from debilitating birth defects, both physical and mental. Some were born with malformed limbs, others with severe cognitive impairments. There were reports of children with large, bulging eyes, twisted spines, or cleft palates. Some children were so severely affected that they could not even speak or walk. It is unclear how many of these children survived infancy, but those who did were often left to live out their lives in seclusion, hidden away from the eyes of the outside world. Despite the mounting evidence that their bloodline was deteriorating, the family continued with their practices. The need to preserve the purity of their lineage remained paramount, even as their children's suffering grew more pronounced. The idea of intermarrying within the family to preserve noble blood, though born out of a desire to maintain control and status, had now become a curse. The family's refusal to seek outside help or to acknowledge the devastating consequences of their actions only deepened the tragedy. By the time the family reached its later generations, their physical and mental decline had become impossible to ignore. The family members who remained in the estate were a shadow of the once proud figures who had founded the lineage. The manor that had once been filled with the sounds of noble life was now eerily quiet, as the family members who survived were either too sick to move or too mentally incapacitated to interact with one another. The estate itself, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, had fallen into disrepair, mirroring the family's own decline. The once grand halls were now filled with the faint smell of decay, the walls crumbling as if they, too, were infected by the same forces that had ravaged the family. Medical knowledge in the 18th century was rudimentary at best, and the genetic consequences of inbreeding were not yet understood. But it seems clear that the family, desperate to preserve its noble bloodline, ignored any warnings or signs that their practices were leading to disaster. The family had no concept of genetic inheritance as we understand it today. What they knew of biology and heredity was limited to the most basic observations, such as the passing down of physical traits like eye color or hair color. But they could not have known the profound impact that continued inbreeding would have on their genetic pool. As the family members aged, their conditions worsened. The mental and physical impairments that had begun in the earlier generations became all-encompassing, leaving the remaining family members unable to function in any meaningful way. Some were confined to beds, unable to move, speak, or care for themselves. Others were left to wander the estate in a fog of confusion, their minds a blur of incoherent thoughts and images. The estate, once a place of pride and power, had become a prison, a tomb for a bloodline that had clung to its existence for far too long. It is perhaps the family's stubborn refusal to acknowledge their decline that makes their story so tragic. They could have sought help, could have turned to the medical professionals of their time, but they chose instead to hide in their isolation. There are whispers that the family believed their afflictions were the result of a curse, not a biological flaw. They clung to the idea that their lineage was being punished for some unknown transgression, and they resorted to superstitious practices to try and cleanse themselves of the affliction. Rumors speak of strange rituals carried out in the dead of night, of prayers whispered into the walls of the manor, of sacrifices made in an attempt to appease whatever forces they believed were at work against them. But no amount of superstition could halt the decay that was taking place. The family's physical and mental decline was the inevitable result of their genetic isolation. Their refusal to acknowledge the biological reality of their situation, combined with their obsession with maintaining the purity of their bloodline, sealed their fate. They had trapped themselves within a cycle of inbreeding, a vicious loop that only worsened with each generation. The family's downfall was not just a biological tragedy, but also a cultural one. They had failed to adapt to the changing world around them, clinging to outdated notions of aristocracy and lineage while the rest of Saxony and Europe moved forward. The estate, once a symbol of noble power and wealth, had become a monument to their refusal to evolve, a testament to the dangers of isolation and genetic ignorance. The family's obsession with their bloodline, their attempt to preserve their nobility at all costs, had ultimately led them to ruin. In the end, the family's name faded into obscurity, lost to history. Their once vast estate crumbled, its walls rotting away as time marched on. The descendants of the bloodline, if they existed at all, disappeared into the shadows of history, leaving behind only the traces of their tragic tale. What was once a proud legacy had become a cautionary tale, one that serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of inbreeding, obsession, and the refusal to confront the consequences of one's actions. The family's name may have been erased from the annals of history, but the lessons learned from their tragic story remain, echoing through the ages. As the family's health deteriorated and their isolation deepened, the whispers of a curse surrounding them grew louder. To outsiders, the family's growing number of physical and mental afflictions seemed like an unfortunate but explainable result of their insular lifestyle. The family, however, saw their deteriorating condition as something far more sinister, a curse, a punishment for some transgression they could not understand. Perhaps, they believed, they were being punished by a higher power for the secrets they kept or for their refusal to integrate with the wider world. Their health problems, instead of being recognized as the biological consequences of inbreeding, were instead attributed to dark forces beyond their control. And so, they turned to superstition and ritual, hoping to cleanse themselves of the curse they felt weighed heavily upon them. The notion of a curse was not unusual in the 18th century. Medical knowledge was still in its infancy, and the causes of many illnesses, both physical and mental, were poorly understood. It was not uncommon for people to attribute strange diseases or afflictions to supernatural forces, particularly when the symptoms were inexplicable or outside the norms of everyday life. In a time when the concept of genetics was entirely unknown, the family's mounting health issues were simply beyond explanation. The bizarre and seemingly random array of birth defects and mental disorders that affected successive generations could not have been explained through any kind of biological understanding. So, instead, the family turned to the only explanation that made sense to them, the supernatural. They consulted local healers, mystics, and even the clergy, searching for any way to reverse the damage they believed had been done to them. Rituals were performed in an attempt to lift the supposed curse. Offerings were made, sometimes at the dead of night, when the moon was said to hold the greatest power. The family believed that by appeasing the unknown forces they had angered, they could break free of the hold the curse seemed to have on them. There were whispers of strange ceremonies that took place in the mansion, rituals meant to purify the family's bloodline, to cleanse them of the sickness that plagued them. The family even purportedly turned to esoteric practices, dabbling in alchemy and other occult sciences, hoping to uncover a way to undo the damage. Yet no matter how many rituals they performed, no matter how many offerings were made, the symptoms only worsened. The family's youngest generation seemed the most affected, with multiple children born with severe physical deformities, mental impairments, and crippling genetic diseases. Their bodies were frail, their minds fragile, and the estate that once served as a symbol of the family's wealth and nobility now seemed like a prison, its walls closing in tighter as the family's descent continued. But the idea of a curse was not entirely out of step with the times. In the absence of scientific understanding, people often looked to the supernatural to explain the inexplicable. And in many ways, the family's choice to believe in a curse was a way for them to maintain some sense of agency over their rapidly deteriorating situation. By framing their suffering as a curse, they could maintain the belief that it was something external, something that could be undone by appeasing the right forces. They could still hope for redemption, even as their condition worsened, and in that hope, they clung to the belief that the curse could somehow be lifted. However, the family's refusal to confront the real cause of their downfall, the inbreeding that had led to their genetic decline, meant that they were blind to the reality of their situation. They continued to focus on the supernatural, while the biological forces at play went unrecognized. The notion of a curse allowed them to maintain some illusion of control, but it also kept them from taking the necessary steps to stop the cycle of suffering. The family's unwillingness to acknowledge the genetic damage they had inflicted on their own bloodline only prolonged their agony. At the same time, the idea of a curse further isolated them from the outside world. Those who might have been able to help, doctors, geneticists, or even concerned family members, were kept at arm's length. The family had grown so insular that they had no real contact with the outside world, and thus no one could intervene to break the pattern. They had become so entrenched in their belief in the supernatural that they were unable to accept the simplest of explanations for their plight. And so, the family retreated further into their estate, clinging to their superstitions as their health continued to decline. For those outside the family, the idea of a curse was merely an excuse. Rumors spread, and the community began to view the estate with increasing suspicion. People who had once respected the family's noble lineage now whispered behind closed doors about the strange happenings within the walls of the estate. Some believed that the family had turned to dark arts or occult practices, further fueling the idea that their decline was not simply the result of biology, but of their own moral failings. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and status, became a place of fear, a warning to others about the dangers of isolation and the price of secrets. The truth, of course, was much less mysterious, yet far more tragic. The family's physical and mental decline was not due to a curse, but to the deadly consequences of generations of inbreeding. What had begun as an attempt to maintain a noble bloodline had resulted in a series of genetic defects that were now impossible to ignore. The family had trapped themselves in a cycle of degeneration, and no amount of ritual or superstition could undo the damage that had been done. Their genetics had been irrevocably altered by their closed-off, isolated existence. The very blood that they had worked so hard to preserve had become tainted, and their belief in a curse only kept them from facing the harsh reality of their situation. In many ways, the family's plight mirrors the historical tendency to turn to superstition when faced with the unknown. Without an understanding of genetics, the family saw no other explanation for their suffering. They could not comprehend how their own actions had led to their downfall, and so they blamed external forces, an invisible curse, a malevolent spirit, or some other supernatural entity. This belief system allowed them to maintain their dignity, to preserve some sense of pride in the face of their deteriorating circumstances. But in the end, the real tragedy lay in their refusal to face the biological reality that was unfolding within their bloodline. Had the family sought help from the outside world, had they accepted that their condition was the result of their own actions, they might have been able to break free from their self-imposed isolation. Perhaps they could have found ways to heal their bloodline, or at the very least, prevent further generations from suffering. But they chose to remain cloistered in their belief in the supernatural, and in doing so, they ensured that the cycle of inbreeding and decline would continue unchecked. Their refusal to face the truth not only doomed them but left their story shrouded in mystery and superstition for centuries. The family's belief in a curse, while understandable in the context of the time, ultimately served as a mask for their own tragic ignorance. By attributing their suffering to supernatural forces, they avoided confronting the genetic realities of their situation. Their fate, intertwined with their misguided attempt to preserve their noble bloodline, became a dark cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of isolation, superstition, and the failure to recognize the very real consequences of one's actions. The estate, abandoned and crumbling, still stands as a monument to their refusal to break free from the cycle they had created. And while the curse may have been imaginary, the damage done to their bloodline was all too real. As the years wore on, the family's once proud legacy continued to deteriorate, leaving behind a tragic shadow of what it had once been. The estate, which had once been a vibrant center of wealth, power, and influence, now stood as little more than a crumbling monument to the family's ruin. The expansive halls, filled with portraits of long-dead ancestors, had grown silent, haunted by the memories of a bloodline that had stubbornly clung to its noble identity while slowly unraveling from within. And yet, despite the physical decay of the estate, something far darker was taking root within the family, a sense of desperation that would only deepen as their decline continued. By the late stages of the family's isolation, the estate had become less a home than a mausoleum, its walls encasing not just the family but their many secrets. It was here, within these decaying walls, that the reality of their situation began to fully unfold. The family's efforts to preserve their bloodline had now resulted in something even more insidious than genetic decline. In their obsession with maintaining their noble status, they had also sealed themselves off from any possibility of outside help. This isolation created a vicious cycle that left them increasingly trapped in their own world, with no one to intervene. They had become prisoners not just of the estate but of their own choices. The disease of inbreeding that had plagued their lineage had become so advanced that by the time the last surviving family members reached adulthood, they were living shadows of what they had once been. Some of them were physically deformed, others mentally incapacitated, and still others were unable to even care for themselves. They had become so genetically damaged that even the most basic tasks of daily life had become insurmountable challenges. The family's fate had been sealed, and their suffering became both a testament to the dangers of unchecked obsession and a reflection of the consequences of ignoring the basic principles of biology. But the family's decline was not merely physical. The mental toll of living in such isolation, of being cut off from the outside world for so long, had begun to take a psychological toll as well. The family had, in their attempts to preserve their status, allowed their own minds to wither in tandem with their bodies. The longer they remained trapped within their estate, the more distant they became from reality. The mental and emotional toll of their seclusion was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of their story. The estate had once been a place where noble ideals, power, lineage, and legacy were upheld above all else. But now, those ideals had twisted into something grotesque. The family members, who had once prided themselves on their ability to maintain their noble heritage, were now nothing more than hollow figures, barely able to recognize one another. The family, once united by blood and a sense of shared purpose, had now become strangers to each other, disconnected by the very force that had bound them together, blood. The bonds that had once held the family in a position of power now served only to imprison them in a downward spiral of genetic ruin and mental decay. As the family's health continued to decline, they became even more reclusive. The outside world had long since ceased to matter to them. The world beyond the estate had become nothing more than a distant memory. The family's name had all but disappeared from the public eye, and the manor, which had once been a symbol of their nobility, had grown cold and forgotten. No one came to visit. No one cared about the fate of the family. In fact, many people had long since assumed that the family had died out or that they had simply disappeared from history altogether. Yet, even as their physical and mental faculties deteriorated, the family continued to insist on their nobility. They clung to the idea that their bloodline was still of value, still worth preserving, even as their bodies betrayed them. They refused to acknowledge the reality of their situation, the genetic damage that had accumulated over generations, the irreversible consequences of their decisions. Instead, they maintained an illusion of grandeur, even as the estate continued to rot around them. In many ways, their refusal to accept the truth about their situation mirrored their refusal to face the consequences of their inbreeding. They had created an image of themselves as noble, untouchable, and pure, but that image had long since been shattered by the reality of their declining health. Despite the mounting evidence that their bloodline was degenerating, They clung desperately to the notion that they were still a powerful family, deserving of respect and admiration. But the reality of their physical and mental decline could not be ignored. The family's once proud name, once associated with wealth and influence, had become little more than a ghost of its former self. And yet, even as their bodies and minds decayed, the family continued to hold on to the last remnants of their noble pride. They refused to let go of the past, refused to accept that their bloodline had been irrevocably damaged. It was as if they were caught in some kind of cruel delusion, unwilling to face the truth of their situation. The family's refusal to acknowledge their downfall, their blind adherence to a misguided sense of noble identity, only deepened the tragedy of their story. The idea of legacy, of preserving one's name and bloodline, had once been the driving force behind the family's decisions. But now, that same desire for legacy had become their undoing. The family's insistence on maintaining their noble status, despite the overwhelming evidence that their bloodline was damaged beyond repair, kept them locked in a cycle of denial. They could not let go of the past, could not accept that their once proud name was no longer worthy of the respect it had once commanded. In their desperation to preserve their legacy, they had sealed their fate, condemning themselves to a slow, painful decline. The estate, now in ruins, stood as a silent testament to their downfall. Its walls, cracked and crumbling, seemed to echo the fading voices of a once great family, long since forgotten by the world. The grand halls, which had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, were now silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind blew through the broken windows. The portraits of long-dead ancestors still hung on the walls, their painted faces staring down at the decaying remnants of the bloodline they had once built. But even as the family's name faded into obscurity, their story lived on, hidden in the shadows of history. The estate, abandoned and overgrown, stood as a stark reminder of the dangers of obsession, of the price one pays for clinging to a false sense of nobility. The family's legacy, once a source of pride and power, had been reduced to nothing more than a tragic footnote in the annals of history. In the end, the family story is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of isolation, inbreeding, and the refusal to accept the inevitable. The estate may have decayed, the bloodline may have withered, but the lessons to be learned from their downfall endure. The family's obsession with preserving their legacy, with maintaining their purity at any cost, led them to destroy the very thing they sought to protect. They became prisoners of their own choices, locked in a cycle of degeneration that they could neither escape nor undo. Their name, once a symbol of power, had become a symbol of tragedy, a warning to future generations about the dangers of clinging too tightly to the past. As the years passed, the estate stood as a hollowed relic, its grand design now obscured by time and neglect. The family, once a proud line of noble descent, had become a mere whisper in the local folklore, their history fading into nothing more than a tragic legend, a cautionary tale of the dangers of obsession, isolation, and misguided pride. The surrounding land, once carefully cultivated, had reverted to wild overgrowth, reclaiming the soil as nature began to swallow the remnants of human ambition. The once manicured gardens were now tangled with weeds, and the estate's once grandiose exterior had become weathered and chipped, as if the house itself were weeping in the silence of its own collapse. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of despair. It was as though time had stalled in the place, the air perpetually heavy with the scent of decay. The walls, which had once adorned portraits of forebears who embodied the family's legacy, now sagged with dampness, the portraits themselves faded and obscured by the encroaching darkness. The rooms that once echoed with the sound of footsteps, the rustling of elegant gowns, and the murmurs of courtly conversations, were now silent. In the rooms where children had once played, their laughter replaced by the eerie stillness, there were only the faint creaks of the old timbers shifting under the weight of years gone by. The windows, once pristine and clear, were now shattered or covered with grime, allowing only slivers of light to enter, casting long, mournful shadows that stretched across the cracked floors. It was in this broken, abandoned manor that the family's last surviving members lingered, the echoes of their past selves haunting every corner. Their physical and mental states had deteriorated beyond recognition. The effects of inbreeding, compounded by years of isolation, had taken a heavy toll. They were shadows of their former selves, their identities stripped away by the ravages of their own choices. The mental fog that had settled over them made it impossible to discern whether they still recognized one another, let alone the legacy that had once defined them. It was said that some of them wandered aimlessly through the halls, calling out names they had long forgotten, speaking in a language that no one could understand. In the final stages of their existence, they seemed little more than ghosts trapped within the walls of their own house, disconnected from the world outside and from each other. The family, once tightly bound by blood and tradition, had now fragmented into isolated, broken individuals. The sense of unity that had once existed between them, a unity built upon shared nobility and a common ancestry, had been replaced by confusion and detachment. The bonds of family had eroded into something almost unrecognizable. What remained was a fractured, debilitated group, whose shared history had become too painful to confront. The few surviving members were left to grapple with the inescapable reality of their situation, but without the clarity to understand the root of their suffering. Their minds, like their bodies, had been irreversibly damaged. The manor itself had become a reflection of this degeneration. A once proud symbol of the family's wealth and status had turned into a crumbling testament to their failure. The estate, which had once been a fortress of power and privilege, had now become a prison. A prison not only of stone and iron but of the family's own making. No one from the outside world visited anymore. The family's reclusive nature had long since alienated them from the rest of society. It was as though they had become forgotten, not just by the world but by time itself. They had sealed themselves off from history, from reality, and, in doing so, from the possibility of redemption. The estate, isolated on its hill, stood as a symbol of the family's futile attempts to preserve their legacy, even as that legacy slowly crumbled around them. Locals had long whispered about the family's strange ways, about the odd rituals that had been performed within the manor's walls, and about the children who had been born into a world of suffering and isolation. Over the years, the rumors had spread like wildfire, gaining new layers with each retelling. Some spoke of madness, claiming that the family had gone insane in their pursuit of purity and status. Others claimed the family had turned to dark, occult practices in an attempt to rid themselves of their perceived curse. But whatever the rumors, the truth of the family's decline remained obscured, hidden behind the crumbling walls of their manor and the layers of mystery that shrouded their existence. What was undeniable, however, was that the family had become a shadow of its former self. They had built their lives upon the notion that their bloodline was sacred, untouchable by the forces of time or biology. They had believed that the purity of their ancestry would protect them from the ravages of the world. But in their obsession with maintaining this purity, they had neglected the most basic truth, that all things, even noble bloodlines, are subject to the laws of nature. They had attempted to preserve their legacy by isolating themselves, but in doing so, they had doomed their lineage to destruction. The very blood they had sought to protect had turned on them, and there was no escape from the consequences of their choices. Now, as the last surviving members of the family faced their final days within the decaying walls of the manor, the estate had become little more than a tomb. The air was thick with a sense of finality, as though the house itself was mourning the loss of its once great inhabitants. The windows, broken and weathered, allowed only faint glimpses of the outside world, but it was a world that had long since forgotten the family within. The once grand staircase, now covered in dust and cobwebs, stood as a silent monument to the family's former grandeur, its elegant curves now bent with the weight of years of neglect. The final survivors of the family had long since stopped trying to understand their situation. Their lives had become a series of disjointed moments, a blur of confusion and pain. Some say that the last few members of the family, in their madness, believed they were still living in a time when their name held power, when their bloodline was still pure and noble. Others say they no longer recognized the estate or even each other. Their lives had become so intertwined with the decay of the manor that they could no longer distinguish where the family ended and the house began. The estate, in its silent collapse, had become as much a part of them as their own broken bodies and minds. In the end, the family story ended not with a flourish, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible fading. The estate, once a hub of noble activity, became abandoned, its walls echoing with the whispers of a forgotten legacy. No heir appeared to take up the mantle, and no records of the family's decline were written down. In time, the manor was swallowed by the landscape, its very existence reduced to myth and rumor. The family that had once tried so desperately to preserve its name and its bloodline was no longer a part of history. Instead, their story lived on only in fragments, in the eerie ruins of their estate, in the dark corners of local legends, and in the faded memories of those who had once whispered of their tragic fate. And so, the estate stood, still and silent, an empty shell of a forgotten time. The once proud name of the family had long since faded into obscurity, leaving behind nothing but the crumbling remnants of their existence. Their desire to preserve their legacy had led them to destroy it. The family story, a cautionary tale of obsession and pride, would remain lost to time, a tragic reminder of the perils of inbreeding, isolation, and the pursuit of an unattainable purity. The estate may have fallen into ruin, but its story, though lost in the mists of history, continued to echo as a warning for generations to come. The legend of the family that had once resided within the crumbling estate persisted, spreading beyond the confines of their isolated manor and into the local folklore. Over the years, the story took on a life of its own, transforming into a dark, haunting myth that was told around campfires, whispered in hushed tones, and recounted in the quiet corners of taverns. People would speak of the cursed family in hushed tones, weaving their tale into the tapestry of eerie stories that populated the dark corners of the community's collective consciousness. The family's fate, a tragic result of their own obsession with purity, became a symbol of what happens when one clings too tightly to ideals of nobility and bloodline. It served as a warning to those who sought to elevate themselves above others, to separate themselves from the world around them, and to preserve their identity at all costs. The legend portrayed the family as victims of their own pride, their bloodline deteriorating as they sought to protect it from the very forces of time and nature. The irony of their story, their desperate attempts to keep their name pure only leading to their downfall, became the heart of the myth, a cautionary tale for those who would follow in their footsteps. But as the years passed, the real story of the family faded into the obscurity of time. Those who had known the family or had even witnessed their decline were few in number, and those that remained were often too afraid to speak of the events that had taken place within the estate's walls. There were those, of course, who claimed to know the full story, tales of secret rituals performed in the dead of night, of strange voices echoing through the manor, and of the twisted, malformed children born into the family's decaying lineage. But the truth of the family's decline had become obscured, lost in the fog of superstition and myth. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the legend was the estate itself. Even after the last of the family had perished, the manor remained, stubbornly standing against the test of time. Its crumbling walls, overgrown with ivy and obscured by the passage of decades, seemed to bear witness to the family's tragic history. It became a place of pilgrimage for the curious, a destination for those with a taste for the macabre. The manor's decaying state only added to its mystique. Its once grand facade was now covered in moss and grime, its windows shattered, and its doorways half-collapsed. Yet, despite its ruin, the estate still seemed to have an air of malevolence about it, as if it were not simply a house, but a living thing that had borne witness to the death of a once proud family. Some claimed that the ghosts of the family still haunted the manor, their spirits trapped within the walls, forever repeating the tragic history that had sealed their fate. There were reports of strange noises emanating from the estate at night, unexplained footsteps echoing through the hallways, the faint sound of crying drifting on the wind, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as though the house itself had absorbed the sorrow and suffering of its inhabitants, holding on to their pain even after their physical forms had gone. The very air around the manor seemed charged with a dark energy, an oppressive atmosphere that made anyone who dared to venture too close feel uneasy. The idea that the family's curse had transcended death, that their suffering was not merely physical but eternal, became a dominant part of the legend. As the estate continued to decay, it became an almost forbidden place, a location that the locals would tell their children to stay away from. It became a part of the local mythology, an ominous landmark that symbolized both the power and the fragility of human existence. Many believed that the house was not just a physical structure, but a vessel for the family's unresolved tragedy, an object imbued with a malevolent energy that could bring misfortune to anyone who came too close. It was said that anyone who dared to spend the night in the manor would be cursed, their lives marked by bad luck and misfortune, a direct result of disturbing the resting place of the family's troubled spirits. Yet, in the shadows of the myth, there were also those who found themselves fascinated by the story, those drawn to the dark allure of the manor's tragic past. They would come to the estate, armed with cameras and curiosity, seeking to uncover the truth behind the family's demise. Some even went so far as to conduct their own investigations, attempting to unearth the truth behind the curse, hoping to uncover some evidence of the family's mysterious end. For them, the estate was a riddle to be solved, a dark puzzle that held the key to understanding what had really happened. But for all their efforts, none seemed able to unravel the mystery. Every step they took within the decaying estate only led them deeper into the enigma, further away from the answers they sought. Despite the ongoing interest in the estate and its tragic past, the true story of the family remained elusive. Historians and researchers who attempted to piece together the family's history found that records were sparse, if not entirely absent. Official documents were either missing or heavily redacted, and what few records remained were often incomplete, fragmented, or contradictory. Some suggested that the family's isolation had been so complete that even their neighbors had no real knowledge of their activities, leaving the family's decline to fester in secrecy. The absence of clear documentation only fueled the mystery, adding a layer of intrigue to the already tragic tale. The estate, much like the family, had become an enigma, its true nature obscured by time, superstition, and the vagaries of history. Its crumbling walls and overgrown grounds served as a silent witness to a bygone era, a forgotten family, and a tragic tale of obsession and ruin. Over the years, the estate was stripped of its value, both as a historical site and as a place of power. The land surrounding it, once cultivated and maintained with the precision of the aristocracy, had become wild and untamed, a reflection of the decay within. There was, however, a final chapter to the manor story, one that remained whispered among the few locals who still remembered the family. As the estate fell into disrepair, it was eventually abandoned entirely, left to the elements and the encroaching wilderness. The manor, in its final days, had become a part of the landscape itself, slowly sinking into the earth as nature reclaimed it. Some said that even as the house collapsed, it still emitted a strange, mournful sound, an unearthly wail that could be heard in the dead of night, a sound that mirrored the suffering of the family who had once lived there. It was as if the manor, despite its physical decay, continued to mourn the loss of its inhabitants, a house unable to escape the legacy of its own tragic history. And so, the estate became little more than a ghost, fading from memory, though its tale would continue to haunt those who had heard it. The family's name was lost to time, their history preserved only in fragmented whispers and scattered rumors. The manor, long abandoned, continued to crumble in silence, its ruins a testament to the family's refusal to change, their obstinate clinging to purity and status, and their inevitable fall from grace. Their legacy was no longer one of nobility, but one of tragedy, an eternal reminder of the dangers of isolation, obsession, and the inability to recognize when the past has outlived its time.